Hello everyone, we are actually talking about climate change today. Interestingly, there's a lot of time that's been wasted discussing whether there is climate change or there's no climate change. One thing, it's important for all of us to realize that climate change is for real, and it's not just climate change, it's climate emergency that the entire planet is actually facing. In last several months, we've actually seen extreme events. World is heating up faster than we had anticipated. We've seen the IPCC report that clearly talks about that we'll hit 1.5 degrees in next 20 years and almost by 2.7 by the end of century, and can lead to, in the worst case scenario, it can also be 4.4 degrees. Please understand that all these catastrophes that we're actually seeing right now, the extreme weather events that we're seeing right now, globally and locally, is when the average warming is only 1.1. So imagine what the situation will be when the temperature is 1.5 or 2.7 or 4.4. We've seen wildfires, we've seen floods in Germany, we've seen hurricanes, etc. In India itself, in last 15-20 days, we've seen situation in Kerala, the flooding and landslides in Kerala, in Uttarakhand, in Darjeeling, the number of cyclones that have taken place. So one thing, let's agree that there is climate change, and climate change is not just happening in one part of the world, but is happening in different parts of the world in different forms. Often we think that these events, like a cloud burst in Uttarakhand, is a one-off event. It just happened because the weather gods were not so happy. But if you look at the frequency of these so-called one-off events, you'll realize that there is a pattern. So if you need to understand or do justice to this conversation, we need to link these events with climate change, consider them not as a one-off event, but a climate event, and connect all of those. Also, this is not just an environmental issue. There are many studies that have taken place. One about India talks about, in last 365 days, that is in last 1 year, India has actually lost $37 billion US, or loss of around 3.5% to its GDP, just because of climate events or climate related disasters. And in all of this, while we're talking about these huge events in different parts of the world, imagine poorest of the poor and the farmers are the most vulnerable. And interestingly, it's irreversible damage. So when there's a rise in sea level, a lot of these damages because of climate are actually irreversible, which you cannot fix in 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years. Now, after establishing the fact that there is climate change, and climate change is not just in books, it's actually happening on the ground, let's understand climate negotiations, because this is also the season when world tallest leaders have actually assembled, all of them at Glasgow right now. They were in Rome yesterday discussing what should the world look like, or how do we actually arm twist one another or negotiate and agree on stopping climate change. We saw something like this happen in Paris in 2015 and now happening in Glasgow, so-called COP meetings that we're talking about. So COP26 is happening in Glasgow. Just the historical context of climate change or climate change negotiations. There was agreed understanding that there are historical polluters. So 7 countries of the world, or the 7 richest countries of the world, actually contribute to almost 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at G20, and India is also part of that, G20 nations' annual contribution to global emissions is almost 66%. So we're talking about a small bunch of nations actually polluting the atmosphere. And mind you, when you pollute, it doesn't go away. It actually stays in your atmosphere, or these greenhouse gases at least stays in your atmosphere for 150 years, 200 years, or sometimes some gases actually stay for 1,000 years too. So what you've done, say 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and I'm talking about the West here, I'm talking about prominent historical polluters like Europe and America, and the new polluter, the biggest polluter right now, China, almost 33% is its carbon share. That pollution stays for a long, long time. So interconnectedness of issues. So if you were actually facing a climate change or climate event in India, a lot of it can be attributed to the past action of countries, these 7 richest countries of the world. That's the country dynamics. Oxfam also talks about how 10% of of world's population, which is 10% of the richest people, actually contribute 50% to world's population. So there's a class amongst nations and there's class amongst population as well. That is the biggest contributor. One thing that came out of the Paris summit, and that is very, very important for all of us to understand, that these rich nations agreed to actually contribute around 100 billion and fund this entire transition to a low carbon economy. So there was supposed to be funding of around 100 billion US dollars given to developing nations, so as there is technology transfer, there's finance, and there is a green roadmap to this planet. Interestingly, and again as per Oxfam's report, a lot of this 100 billion has been spent in the most horrid way, or in almost like a scam way, where private investment or private money that's been given to corporates, or for that matter, money given for road construction, or for that matter, money given to the central government is actually calculated as climate funds. So there's no transparency, or there's no accountability, or there's no real understanding of climate funds or climate funding. A lot of this $100 billion, nobody even knows where that has gone, or if it has actually been spent on actual climate mitigation and adaptation, or just has been number management in many, many ways. Problem of the past is also problem of the future. So we, of course, need to look at what has happened earlier, the biggest emitters, as I said, US and Europe and UK in that sense. But the problem is of future emission. We haven't even seen 60% of that. And, the way countries like India or countries like China actually industrialize or look at its energy sector or its industries, that is what will define how our planet looks like. So there's some crime done in the past, and there is an opportunity to grow in a greener way, and that is what we need to really understand. Today, imagine as we speak, this year, almost 40% of global emissions, as in greenhouse gas emissions, comes from coal thermal power plants or coal powered industries. Second, or almost like similar kind of a contribution, is of mobility sector, the way we move our vehicles, and these two sectors are the biggest polluters. So when we're actually imagining a green roadmap, or if world leaders are actually discussing climate change, it's important for us to understand both coal, which is this power or the industry sector, and or the energy sector, and our mobility sector. In short term, a lot of times we say that yes, we can move to CNG or we can move to gas. In mid-term, we need to really look at rail networks and better road networks in that sense, and eventually perhaps move to carbon. So there needs to be a green roadmap when we are discussing this, and I think perhaps countries right now, the powerful countries, the developed countries and the developing countries, G8 or G20 or G number countries, need to really discuss how do we actually handhold each other and get on that green path, which is equitable, which actually talks about justice. The reason why I bring in the issue of climate justice and climate equity or environmental justice in that sense is because that is something which is often forgotten or ignored by the first world, the historical polluters of the world. Right now, there's something that's being discussed globally. There's a term called net zero. And the first world wants, India and many other countries to actually, sign up for this concept called net zero. And I feel, and many other people feel, that it's a big sham. It's something which is like a farce. You're expecting third world to stop its pollution or stop growing by 2050 while you have already grown or while you have actually polluted already. Now, there needs to be, if you want India, and India definitely should get into a net zero situation or that state, but we need more time, and to reach there, we actually need more money. So developed nations can't just get away by saying, oh, India, fix your mess. You will have to fix our mess because we are suffering in many, many ways because of your mess or because the way you have industrialized yourself. So we need to act as country, as countries, as individually, as respectively, but as well as together. Collective responsibility, collective sharing, collective future carving is extremely important. India's contribution right now historical greenhouse gas contribution is around 3%, and its annual flow is around 7%. So we might be a tiny contributor in this entire big carbon debate or carbon emission, but potential for countries like India, if India starts growing the way America grew or the way Europe has grown, we will be a disaster. There'll be no planet if India grows at that speed or in that nature. So India needs to act in its own interest. India's 80% population is very, very vulnerable to climate change. India is also a country that has huge number of population that is young and also below the poverty line. So it's a great opportunity for all of us to act. It's very, very important for the first world to not its responsibility and accountability, not just talk about net zero, but also talk about technology transfer and financing green adaptation or climate adaptation policies and movements and projects globally. At the end of the day, of course, this COP is called a negotiation. It almost sounds as if it's a competition. There'll be a winner and loser. No. In this climate negotiation, or in any climate negotiation, or in any climate conversation, there's no winner or loser. We are all losers if we don't act precisely, if we do not really look at this entire thing holistically. So we need a collective plan, a collective responsibility, and a collective hand-holding, and that's where we will be able to carve a better planet. Understand it's too late already. We are seeing these extreme weather events that I talked about. It's going to be extremely, extremely bad for the poor, for the most vulnerable, and it's important that we bring in issue of justice, issue of equity, issue of actual growth to all, and growth which is not carbon intensive but carbon sensitive in many, many ways. Hope our world leaders also show political leadership when they talk about climate change. It's not one-up-manship or one-up-womanship when it comes to carbon or when it comes to climate change. Hope leaders wake up and leaders walk the talk at this COP26 Glasgow event.